I'd like to introduce, our next speaker, who is Bob Martin. I know Bob as my boss from DEP, but Bob is also one of the foremost energy experts in the state of New Jersey, and he will be talking about something we haven't talked about today, transmission. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. Nice to see you. First off, thank you to NJBIA. Appreciate what you do and the leadership you have in this state to get the word out there and continue to fight for the businesses of the state and for the overall economy. Michelle Sikirka, thank you very much. Ray Cantor, to you and your team. Ray, thank you for pulling this off. It's absolutely a great crowd and a great event, so thank you very much for that. After all these topics this morning, I want to jump in here and just give a rebuttal, or I jump in on all of it. We start talking about DEP, BPU, permitting, all the rest. I'd love to do that, but I've gotten one narrow topic today. I'm going to stick on transmission and focus on that. What I'm going to do today is focus on, again, at a national level, broad spectrum, looking at transmission, at the challenges and the issues around transmission in the U.S. If you came here to listen to me talk about PJM or the price of electricity in New Jersey, you can go catch lunch early if you'd like to right now, because I'm not going to talk about that specifically. I'm going to talk about broadly what are the challenges and how do we move forward in the state, not just the state, but all the states on transmission overall. The bottom line is for us that we need to have a grid that's responsive for reliability, for economic growth overall. It's got to have the ability to be robust to handle the demand of what's going on in the whole demand overall across this country. And if we don't have a strong grid, no matter how much generation you have, no matter how much generation you produce, it's not going to carry it. It's not going to be able to inject it in. You're not going to be able to take it out. And so we've got to, that's why I've narrowed the discussion around today. And again, what I'm trying to look at is over the next 25 years of what's going on in the grid. I'm not just looking at today. We've got problems today, but we've got to plan this out looking forward. Last year, I stood in front of all of you talking about the perfect storm and talking about electric power in the U.S. I know we mentioned earlier it's a cliche. Well, guess what? It's real, and it's a real problem overall. Again, I talked about the electricity crisis coming in the U.S., which we all saw the signs, but there were several legs to that were a problem that we needed to look at. And again, I dubbed it the perfect storm because there were convergence of so many issues at the same time. In the past, we've only seen bits and pieces of these issues. Now we're seeing it all converging at once. We expected the fact of that it was going to have a ripple effect across the economy, across growth of businesses, across the pocketbooks of ratepayers around the country. I also mentioned last year, I talked about what are those four key components to it. And there's a lot of subcomponents to it, but I think we need just to be fair to ourselves as we look at this and talk about what those are. Obviously, energy demand. We know the data centers, we know manufacturing, transportation, EV, electrification of homes and businesses. That's obvious. That one we're all talking about, and we understand. Power plant closures. This was driven by a lot of different issues. Some were just straight economics. The growth in the United States of power, 1.5%, 2%, over the last 15, 20, 30 years, was pretty consistent. It's this bulge in it we're looking at right now that's pushing all the different issues across this country. The other part on power plants that was a problem was, I'm very blunt about this, was the greenhouse gas regulations from EPA under the previous administration in Washington. Those regulations ended up driving not just the closure of plants or forcing the closure, looking ahead to plants, but also put a wet towel on any kind of combined cycle or new plants to be built in the United States. Companies pulled back on those investments, waiting to see what was going to happen in the country and be able to do that. And the good news is the current administration has pulled back on those regs to allow some of those to go forward at this point in time for plants to be built. Renewable energy. I still strongly support renewable energy. And at the same time, renewable energy is a challenge because it's not going fast enough. And you've got to have the storage go with it, not just having the panels up and the wind turbines going. You've got to have that. You've got to have the ability to have renewables moving forward. And so today, I'm going to focus on this last item of the perfect storm. Talk about the electric grid, that it needs to be modernized, it needs to be upgraded, it needs to be expanded well beyond what it is today. Basic stats on it. Over 600,000 miles of backbone in this country. 70% of the grid today are over 25 years or older. 70%. Just go back 25 years and think of even what your cell phone looked like. Beyond that, if you think about where this was, I mean, most of the grid was built out in the 60s and 70s. So we're in a situation where the growth that we're looking at, it's not just the growth and adding more lines. We also, at the same time, have to deal with the issue of replacing transmission lines, substations, and other parts to it going forward. Again, the grid is unprepared for the load that we need to have. And again, we can't separate, I know we can't separate PJM or any of the RTOs can't separate generation from the transmission itself. Today, we have to focus on, I'm only going to focus on the transmission piece because that's the most important part of this. There's plenty talking about generation. Let's cover some of the basics on what we're talking about. At the end of the day, FERC controls over everything on this. A lot of different players play into this, and the North American Reliability Corporation, basically NERC, has the overall responsibility for, again, laying out the grid itself and looking across all the different regions. There are three major interconnections, East, West, and Texas. Again, at the same time, the FERC controls the RTOs and what happens with the market mechanisms around that at the same time. At the same time, we also look at the regional reliability entities. NERC has the ability to set the standards for them. When they set those standards, they're enforced by each of the regional reliability entities all across the US. So they're holding the grid together at the end of the day. There are 6 of them. They operate in cooperation with FERC and with cooperation with the RTOs. The last layer of this, if you look at, are the RTOs themselves. So this is the bottom layer to it all. Again, with the RTOs, as we look at these, again, their job, number 1, is reliability. Number 2, again, their job is to deal with the market and control the market and the pricing overall and manage that and whatever the auctions are and how they manage that pricing. And the last part is the regional planning within that grid. That, to me, is one of the most important parts that they play a role in looking forward. And they have to play a key role in that today and in the future to make this work. Let's talk about the challenges. There are several challenges we need to be looking at when we start talking about the grid. Again, just like generation, it's met with unprecedented demand on that grid today. Surging prices are one of the outcomes because of that. And again, when we look at some of the estimates now from DOE is put out there that we need to double the current regional transmission grids by 2050 from where we are today. In 25 years, we have to double that. That is astronomical. And we're going to talk about how we get there and what we can do to get there. The second major issue is the limitations of the grid itself. The ability, and I'm going to cover it in a little more detail in my couple of slides that follow. 2 of the things that are really important are about how much you physically can put into the grid and you can take out of the grid at any point in time. So no matter, back to my point earlier, you can generate all you want, But if you can't plug it in somewhere into the grid, it's not going to work. And if you plug it all the way into the grid and you have no way to take it out and withdraw from the grid, it doesn't make a difference. And I think that's one of the key things we have to keep thinking about as we start looking at the grid and investments in it. Generation is a key component, but if we don't have the grid there, it's not going to work. Again, limited regional transfer capability. That ability we have, we don't have. It's not working the way it should. There's only a limited amount of what can be transferred between. So what you end up with in the U.S. are areas with significant supply and no demand, or places where there's high demand and no supply. And so dealing with that interregional issue is absolutely critical as we go forward. You know, again, one of the DOE reports identified that there are from what we have today, we have to multiply that, or quadruple what we have today for the interregional transmission. That is an important issue, but again, that's on top of doubling the size of the grid from what we have today. Think about just those investments themselves. Aging assets and resiliency risk. I talked about the age of the grid itself. Never mind just replacing and putting on additional assets on that grid, but at the same time, you've got to replace what's there today that's 40, 50 years old. That takes a lot and a lot of investment across the board. Again, we all know and we all hear about the interconnection backlog. You know, there's 2,600 gigawatts in the queues that are out there. Just think about the size of that's sitting in the grid out there, in the queues, that there's a demand to be put into it. Again, there's some rationalization of that has to occur, but that's part of the challenge with all the backlog of it. Let's talk about, you know, some of those issues I just talked about a minute ago on the injection of power into the grid. ICF did a really good report last year that I really liked, and they talked about where are some of the biggest challenges in the grid. If you look at what's on here, the circle that's on that screen, you see where that very light blue area is. That light blue area indicates that we have very little to no ability to inject power into the grid at this time. It shows that there's limitations on it. So if we have generators that want to go into that grid, there's just no ability to do that. And the demand is high to put in those. As we talked about the queue interconnections, people are trying to get into that queue. Well, again, part of that problem is there's nowhere to go, and how do we get there at the end of the day? Again, I already mentioned earlier about doubling the current regional grid itself on transmission capacity by 2050, and also quadrupling the amount we have to put inside the grid. You know, this implies, I mean, based on those numbers, this implies there's about 5,000 miles per year. Think about that, 5,000 miles per year of additional grid transmission lines and substations and all the interconnections that have to be put in place. Just based upon those numbers, that's astronomical. But it's real based upon the demand that's out there that we're seeing in the queue. And sure, that could adjust in the future, but if you're looking out to make investments, you got to look at those numbers. Let's see. The second part of it is withdrawing from the grid. I just talked about injecting. Now you've got to withdraw from the grid. Again, right now, based upon the data, and this again, ICF did a good analysis of this, they looked at looking out through 2028 and said, where are there going to be problems across the board? We know there's challenges in Northern Virginia and Georgia, Texas, parts of the Midwest. You know, there are other places where we still can't, at this point in time, withdraw from the grid. Again, high demand there's no doubt about it, very high demand from data centers, but again, you're looking at manufacturing as well, and all the other components we talked about. Those demands are coming, if not already here. And if you look at those, again, light shaded areas on this map, Those areas already, and there's multiple more across the US that have it in much smaller pockets, but there are still some gigantic pockets that we have to deal with on this side of it. So again, one of the biggest issues that we're looking at. Let's talk about the root causes. First one, regulatory fragmentation and permitting challenges. States still control most of the siting around this, on this, which is a challenge for the federal side of it, even though we can get some leadership from FERC or DOE and others on some of these. Still, the bottom line is states have a lot of control. When you're talking about siting across multiple states, that becomes almost impossible and takes a long period of time to do it. The layers of permitting required from the federal government all the way down to the states and the local government. And we all know about the stories, right, with NEPA. I mean, go try to take on a fight. First off, getting through the NEPA process is long and arduous. Some of it absolutely you need. Some of it then sets the stage for long legal battles forever. Whether it's renewables, I mean, I see it on renewables, I see it on oil and gas pipelines, you see it everywhere. If you want to use NEPA as a tool, NEPA is a good tool for lawyers if you really want to stop a project or slow it down overall. And again, another issue is just disputes over costs and who pays. I know at this point in time, again, if you're sitting on a grid and you feel like your part of the grid is in good shape and the cost point of view, you don't have to, you're not going to, someone says, I want to build this part of the grid out and we're going to share this across overall the grid. I mean, that becomes a bit of a debate right there. And so those debates occur across the country on a constant basis. Slow planning by FERC, NERC, RTOs. And you know what? I know that I'm not looking to poke any RTO in the eye, but I tell you what, FERC was way behind the 8 ball on this. All the planning by the RTOs has been way behind. They've tried to play catch up in the last 2 to 3 years. And the point I put on this slide here is, it's interesting. Here's a little fun fact. The first time we had an RPS standard, Iowa put it in place back in 1983. And since then, even as 2010, when I took over as commissioner of DEP, 29 states had mandatory RPS standards set. So the whole idea that this surge of data centers and all that, we didn't know about. Okay, we all didn't know it. We'll take that as accepted. We did know that renewables were coming down the road and that the grid was not ready to accept them. And we needed a lot more planning, and we knew there was going to be a lot of projects coming in the grid. And those are the planning issues that were not taken, were not heeded, were not planned. We didn't move on those overall. The next two deal with state and local regulators. I mean, utilities and states, and I'll probably emphasize more the regulator part of this, are reliability focused. We in the state, this state and other states, focus on the fact that we want that local utility to provide constant electricity on a constant basis. We don't want to be out during a storm. So reliability sits as number one. And so when you ask about starting to look at the transmission grid overall, way up here, all these companies are focused very heavily, and they should be, on I got to make sure my customers have power when the winds come through, the fires come through, whether hurricanes come through, I've got to fix that. And that's a key important part, because ratepayers are demanding reliability at that level. The second part is the incentives. I mean, state regulators and utilities favor smaller incremental projects. It ties back to the reliability piece. I'm going to build this piece, add on. You're trying to manage the cost. You're trying to minimize the ultimate impact to the ratepayer. And you're building on small projects after small projects overall. It also deals with kind of the regulatory structure, right? It's built upon the regulatory structure of cost recovery, again, rate of return focus, and that's what you're focusing in on. The bigger transformational projects are not sitting in the BPUs of the world and the PSCs across the country. Some places they are, some places they're having them, and maybe I'm sure they're part of the discussions, but to change public policy around that is pretty dramatic. The last piece is just very simply, not enough investment in the grid. And I'll talk about that a little bit here. But again, no matter how much we want to invest, we say we need it, there's just not enough, given all those stats I just gave you. Here's a great chart from Grid Strategies. I love this chart. If you look on this chart, you look from 2010 to 2014, there were over 1,700 miles of new voltage transmission per year, averaging on those years. Pretty solid, that's good. You look at 2015 to 19, it drops down to about 900 miles of high voltage. And again, by 2020 to 2024, in the area we're talking about now, of when the demand is now spiking, we're finding ourselves only about 500 new miles on average of transmission per year. Let's face it, that's just not enough. And unless we're going to start making some serious investments around that to make that happen, that is not going to work out for us. And again, this is all large, 345 kV lines or greater that we need to have in place to move the electricity around the country in so many different places. Let's talk about solutions. All right, so what do we do? First, again, FERC ordered in 2024, 1920. First it started putting together the 20-year planning horizons. This to me was a breakthrough on FERC looking beyond the next couple of years, but looking well out into the future. I give them credit for it. They've done a good job starting to get their head around it. But again, it talked about the root causes. It was a day late and a dollar short. But here we are now. So where we are is where we are. The good news is this is now in place and we're focusing on it. We also need to build out the interregional transmission piece of that. So the planning part of this can't just be within the RTOs themselves. They've got to be across each of the regions so that we can maximize the grid and utilize it as best we can. And utilize technologies. Modernization of the grid has got to leverage a lot more technology than it does today to be able to move that around. Now, I've been in some of the centers where you see the RTOs and they operate. I mean, it's a wonderful war center. It's well run, it's well operated, but again, taking it to the next level would be the right thing as we go forward in the future. Process and rule changes. I mean, again, we start looking at, the DOE had a coordination, interagency transmission authorization and permitting initiative, which they started. Again, trying to focus on how, having DOE as the lead agency on these projects to try to drive some of the transmission projects for grid optimization. I think that makes sense. It helps. It doesn't fix NEPA, doesn't fix some of the state stuff, but at least it drives, from the administration point of view, somebody taking charge of that project or projects overall. Again, we got to clear out the backlog of connection requests. I think rationalizing these, I talked about it earlier, I know a lot of them are doing that now, but there's a lot of applications that are duplicate across different RTOs and for different places in the grid. So I think that's an important part, is clearing out some of those, because again, everyone's playing the game of putting requests in multiple places to begin to play the shuffle to protect themselves, which you can't blame them because there's no predictability in what they're getting. Let's see. I also want to talk about, I talked about 17, I also want to talk about FERC Order 177. Again, it definitely allows us to move forward more effectively and override some of the state abilities to override some of those initiatives. The next one is leadership. Bottom line is, at the end of the day, FERC needs to continue to provide strong leadership They need to step up and they need to be the leader across the country and feed that direction down across the entire grid, down to NERC, all the way across to the RTOs to make it happen at the end of the day. The RTOs need to take leadership to make sure they're making this happen as well. And strong leadership on those RTOs needs to get out in front. And we're starting to see it by a lot of them starting to realize that they have fallen behind and they're getting to make that happen. Public policy, and this is not a political statement, this is just about what we're seeing. Again, the first part is easy. There needs to be more cooperation, coordination, and planning with the utilities. I think that's an important part of making this happen. The guys handling the distribution part of it need to be working with the generation and transmission even more than ever. And I think what you're seeing right now is I think we're seeing a lot more cooperation, a lot more discussion around it, but I think those have to come up to the next level overall. And it's all the partners on this. It's the grid, it's the transmission, it's the RTOs, and it's the utilities all working closer and closer together to make sure we're aligning supply and demand going forward. The second part on public policy, this is not a political statement, but it's a statement. The reality is we can't have governors delivering separate messages on what their states want to do for policy on energy that's inconsistent with what the need is for the overall grid and the overall region. It's that simple. If you're standalone in your Texas, that's the only one that stands alone by and large, and they do their own thing. And guess what? When there's a big freeze, they're begging Oklahoma for a shitload of power that they can't get. So, the reality is, if you look at all these we've got to make sure that the messages of the governors all across the states get in line and work with with PJM, work with MISO, work with all the other, the RTOs to make sure they're consistent. You can't have a message that says, we're going this way, when the overall picture looks like this. The last piece of investment, DOE estimates the range for putting in the amount of money needed is $1.39 trillion between now and 2050. That number is astronomical. And again, it's not going to come all from the federal government. We'd like to see that from the federal government, but that ain't going to come from the federal government. There needs to be other investors around this. Right now, the Energy Dominance Financing Program is financing some programs at a $2 or $3 billion level. That's good, but it's not great. I think other players that have to play in on this are going to be the private sector. Investments need to play a gigantic role in this. There are plenty of infrastructure funds out there that are all focused on this potentially. I think we have to unleash that part of the investment more so than ever to allow this to continue to grow on transmission across the country. And the last part I would also suggest is that data centers, again, have to figure out where they fit in this grid picture. I mean, I've heard the statement, they don't care what they pay. I've talked to some of those big guys, they do care what they pay. And I think we have to work with them to figure out how do we maximize their need for power at the same time, not shortchange the rest of the pool, everyone else in the pool, especially consumers and other businesses in that. And that can be work behind the meter, it can be work in front of the meter, but they've got to play a role in figuring out that energy needs for their own energy needs and work with all of us to make that happen. And in closing, my last slide, as you can see, I had investment requires 4 key reasons. I have 6. Obviously, I changed my mind late in the process. Again, we're focused on growth. Again, if we don't modernize our grid, we're not going to get the growth we need, full stop. And we're not going to keep the reliability with an aging infrastructure unless we do something about the grid and we keep it top priority along with the generation side of this. Resiliency, with weather, with fires, wildfires, storms continuing, we're going to have to deal with this issue of resiliency. It's not just reliability, it's a resiliency piece of that and how you protect those assets in a time with constant weather changes. Efficiency, we've got to optimize the transmission grid. We need new and leveraged technologies to move forward. If we don't do that, we are not going to be able to get there. Technology has to be a key component to this going forward. Renewables, we're not going to pull on the number of renewables we want at the pace we want until we start building out the grid and modernize it to do that. We could talk all day about how we want to get to a certain amount of renewables over the next several decades. You're not going to get there without a modernized grid. And the last piece, which is critical to all of it, is affordability. We have to be talking about a grid that delivers energy, electricity on a large scale at a very low price to everyone across the grid. You've got to get rid of the congestion problems. You've got to focus on how do you do that. And that comes back to balancing out the grid overall. With that, thank you all very much.